Hello everybody, my name's Jim, and this is a video that was requested by Chatty the Mad Chatter in one of my previous videos where I talked about how I rate different books. Go check her channel out. She has her own YouTube channel. She's a lovely person, and it took me a bit to decide how I wanted to do this because I knew going into it that it would be a very long video. So disclaimer, I'm sorry. If you don't like my voice, then this probably isn't a good video for you. But if you want to play this in the background while you do other work, please leave a like before you start doing something else so that this video is noticed. It really helps my channel out, especially for longer videos like this that require a lot more time. But I first want to preface this with saying that I know a lot of people have certain opinions about how books are rated. And one of the questions that I see come up a lot is, why do people feel the need to include decimals when they rate a book and then say, oh, I round up or round down? As one of those reviewers who includes decimals, I figured that this would be a good video to at least explain my methods and why I do it. My decimal system follows the mathematical rules where if it is 4 and below, it rounds down, and 5 and above, it rounds up, unless I'm able to include a decimal space, which is usually 0.5. So any book that I read that may be, for example, a 4.4 or 4.6 would be a 4.5 in those cases, but I have never come across a rating site or program that allowed me to do decimals. So usually it is rounding up or rounding down to a whole number. But just to talk about my origins and how I've come to rate things this way, I used to be a cereal reviewer, not like cornflakes and Cheerios, but like SERIAL, a cereal reviewer for restaurants and hotels. A few years ago, I haven't really done that too much anymore, but I used to live on Tripadvisor. So whenever we would go to a different place, I would leave reviews, and I became a little bit notable, I guess, among the community there because my reviews were extremely thorough. I backed everything up with evidence and photographs if I could. And, people would like start messaging me about certain areas and what they think would be good. And I'm like, dude, I'm a teenager. I'm in my early 20s. I don't really know everything, but I can at least tell you and explain my experience. And the reason why I used Tripadvisor specifically to review these places is because it broke everything down. It broke your restaurant visit down into different categories like atmosphere, like food quality, service, things like that. Same with hotels, same with amusement parks, or any other place you would go for entertainment. It would automatically break those down. And I appreciated that because I felt that that was a surefire way for me to keep my review honest. And as a result of being a reviewer on Tripadvisor and enjoying that system, I created my own review system when it came to rating movies or rating books in this case. So whenever I go to Goodreads, I have everything broken out into 7 categories. I did have more categories than this, but I felt that they were a bit more niche and specific to the book. I had romance at one point, for example, and not all books have romances. So the 7 categories that I include in my rating are ones that pretty much span across every book. I haven't read a book where I haven't been able to pick one of these 7 categories out. There are some caveats to this system, though, in that I don't rate memoirs this way because memoirs are based on real life, and it's really hard to split these categories out when it comes to real life. I'm not going to speak negatively about characters, for example, because those are real people. They aren't characters, and what they said is what they said. Usually memoirs are rated purely based on the writing style and whether or not I was engaged and could relate to the content. And another type of book, obviously, that I can't rate this way is resource material. So I made a video about the rainforest trees of Samoa. Obviously, that is a book that doesn't even have characters. It doesn't have action. It doesn't have dialogue. It is literally an encyclopedia, and I can't rate that book using this system. For those, it's really what I was able to learn and take in and whether or not I found it helpful for whatever project I'm working on at the time. So those are the caveats. That's the boring stuff. I wanted to get that out of the way. So now I'm going to introduce the 7 elements and talk about how the different questions are weighted, because I know that whenever you read a book, certain things are a lot more important than others. So certain questions that you ask might have a little bit more of an impact just depending on what you're looking for in a specific novel. So just to give you an idea of all the 7 categories and some of the questions that I may ask, for premise and action, how closely does it follow the blurb? So when you read the blurb on the back, does it follow it to a T, or is the story completely different from what you've read? Because usually the blurb is the reason why you pick up a book in the first place. Is the action repetitive? So are the action sequences like the same thing over and over and over again, where it gets to be a little bit too predictable or it starts to become a bit formulaic? Do side plots make sense in the story? Sometimes these side plots are not included in the blurb. So when they're thrown in, do they mix with the main story very well, or do they just seem thrown in as like a tie-in to closed plot holes or something like that? Is the story over or underwhelming? Is there too much or nothing at all going on? That is a pretty straightforward question to ask. For setting and world, is the world clearly defined? So, for example, in areas that maybe don't need as much description, does the book tell you that you are in New York City, or does it just tell you that you are in a city? How well defined is the place that the author wants to set you in? Are settings reused too often? So basically, this is when certain settings become a little bit too redundant. They are side settings. They are settings that the characters visit, and it just seems like they're going to the same place to do the same thing, and it just becomes a little bit routine and kind of going back to the premise and action, formulaic and convenient for the characters to convene in those specific locations. The next question is, can I visualize where we are? So this is mostly for fantasy worlds, but it really works for places like New York City as well, where you can actually place the foliage, you can place the buildings, you can actually see where you are instead of sitting in a white room where there's absolutely nothing going on and you just don't know where you are in the world. And finally, for setting and world, do the surroundings fit the story? So if you have a world that is futuristic and full of androids and robots, are your characters riding horses or camels? You know, does it really make sense for the surroundings to fit the story? And if they do ride horses, maybe make sure that the reader knows why. It might benefit from an explanation. For the characters, straightforward. Are the characters entertaining? If they're boring, I don't want to read the story. I am a character reader, so this is very important for me. How well can I relate to them? Sometimes this isn't a big deal for me, but if I do feel myself being connected to a character in that way, it means a lot more. It means that my rating is probably going to go up. But if this is about a story of someone whose experience I can't one-to-one relate to, then it's really not that big of an issue, as long as you clearly explain who the character is and what their motivations are and how they navigate the world. Because then I feel like I could at least empathize with them and really understand their purpose in life. Are their personalities consistent? So if you have a shy character who all of a sudden goes up on stage and acts out and you know, does these things that are out of character, that have absolutely no build up, basically these are things that happen out of the blue, then it's going to be awkward and weird, and I'm not going to be able to follow that personality too well. Do the characters stand out on their own? There have been a lot of situations where I've read books and I have wished for a spin-off for specific characters. Those are strong side characters. And again, maybe this question isn't weighted so much, but if I do find a character that I love who stands out and could be placed in their own book, then I am more inclined to rate the story higher. for dialogue, is the dialogue awkward, dated, or age inappropriate? So when it comes to being awkward and dated, that might be a difficult thing to rate, but I have read books that the dialogue seems a bit more old-fashioned for the setting that the book takes place in. Obviously, this would be extremely difficult for authors who wrote a story way back in the day and had the setting of, for example, 2023. They wouldn't know how we spoke today. So this question might be one that might not be weighted too heavily just because of the predictive nature and knowing that people can't really predict the future. Is each voice unique? Basically, do all the characters sound exactly the same? This is a pet peeve of mine. I like each of my characters to have their own voice and be able to speak on their own, and for me to know exactly who it is I'm listening to. How repetitive or heavy is the dialogue? So as far as heaviness, a dialogue-heavy novel that doesn't have a lot of action kind of turns into a lecture in my mind. If I don't see enough action breaking up the dialogue, it does cause an issue for me, and it causes me to zone out a little bit. As far as the repetition, this is more along the lines of, are characters saying the exact same thing over and over again? Or is there a lot of miscommunication where it's like the characters are saying, why didn't you tell me this before? It's that sort of thing where I consider repetition and where that turns me off to a book. Does internal dialogue provide a look inside one's perspective? Sometimes people overdo it with the internal dialogue, but I do like to read it when there's something important that I need to know about someone's thoughts and someone's feelings. A lot of times internal dialogue does not come with a tag, so it's important, especially when you have different POVs, or if you are an omniscient narrator who likes to include internal dialogue, to make sure that we understand exactly who is thinking what. Because sometimes that can get muddied and that can get out of hand, and we just don't want that, and that can lower a rating easily for me. I haven't run into that situation yet, luckily, when reading books, but I'm sure that it's out there somewhere. I'm sure that someone watching this video could provide an example. For style and length, is the book too long or too short? Very self-explanatory. Could it have been cut in half, or did it need to be lengthened to really tell the story in a satisfying way? Does anything take you out of the story? So I know that a lot of people don't like flashbacks, for instance. They take people out of the story. Is that an issue for you? And if it is, then maybe you should consider that as part of the author's style. Is there purple prose? This is something that doesn't really bother me. I haven't run into a book that is too terribly purple where it takes me out of the novel, but I know that purple prose is a problem for some, especially if it becomes too wordy, too poetic, too flashy, fancy, colorful, whatever. Are there many errors in the text? This is an editor problem. I mean, obviously the author is the one who introduced the errors in the first place, but it really is up to the editors to find them and to correct them. But I have read some books where whether the editor just missed a bunch of text that was grammatically incorrect, or there were translation errors that took me out of the book and made me dislike it a little bit more than I probably would have had those been fixed before publication. For pacing, does the story drag or move too quickly? If the story drags, obviously, I'm going to be bored. But if it moves too quickly, I'm going to feel like I missed something. I know that there are certain books that are paced a little bit faster, like horror, to increase the tension and push the reader forward. But I do think that there are some instances where taking it slow is a little bit easier on the reader so that they're able to soak in and really comprehend a scene. Is the story memorable? Again, boring. If I can't remember anything about what I've read, that is an issue. And I really need to consider that when I close a book. If the story is forgotten, it probably wasn't that impactful and it wasn't that good for me. Does an element create a stop and go effect? Again, flashbacks sometimes cause this, where you were taken out of the story, it stops the action, and you're forced into this previous scene or this past instance that's being explained so that moving forward in the story, you understand what's going on. If that happens too much, you might get a little bit of whiplash. I've experienced that a few times, and it's just not fun. Is there enough story to allow it to wrap up in a satisfying way? Again, this is a problem with moving too quickly sometimes. If you don't allow your story to end in an organic way that feels satisfying to me, whether things work out or not, it doesn't really matter as long as I'm okay with the ending and I'm like, okay, I see how it got to this point. I see why this was the conclusion. That needs to be done, or else I'm going to close the book and have more questions than answers. Obviously, this can be a little bit different if you have a series and you conclude one of the earlier books in an open-ended way. So that's something to take into account. But there have been a number of novels that I've read where I felt like the ending was rushed or incomplete because it kind of felt like the author just wanted to be done with the story, which I can completely understand. But as a reader, it wasn't that satisfying. And finally, we have stakes. What is there to lose? Hopefully that's defined pretty early on, at least with the main plot. And really, honestly, I would really like to know a little bit of it in the blurb ahead of time, because sometimes the stakes just aren't high enough for me, even if they are clearly defined and this is what the author wanted. I am not a romance reader. I don't really care if the stakes are around love or falling in love. So obviously I would be steering clear of those romance novels. But this kind of ties into the blurb and how a book is being marketed. If it turns into a romance, then I'm not going to be very happy. I'm going to feel a little bit duped. So I like to know what there is to lose ahead of time. If there's more than a romance, then I'll keep reading, possibly. Do you know where the characters stand once the stakes are gone? So once the air is clear, do we know where the characters stand? Is it a happy ending? Do they still have things to work on, but you have this understanding that they are going to do it? Do you feel satisfied that the problem was resolved or resolved itself the way that it did? Those are questions to ask, because sometimes stakes are followed through with. Things go wrong. People die, or to a lesser extent, other disasters could happen. But that kind of goes back into, satisfaction. How satisfied are you now that the stakes have resolved? Are the stakes too easy to overcome? This is something that is pretty common. Unfortunately, I've read a few novels where the stakes are just too easy to overcome, and sometimes they shouldn't be, but it feels like the author decides to throw something in to kind of help the main character along just out of the blue, and that completely removes the stakes immediately. So what could have ultimately been super intense just becomes nothing. It becomes so easy for the character to take on that, it's like, what's even the point of including this scene now? And finally, how obvious is the outcome of each stake? Is this book too predictable? Am I going to know on page 2 exactly how this novel is going to end? Because that is a problem. Even if the pacing is great and I keep going forward, if I see that the ending if I see that the resolution is exactly what I predicted, especially in a book where you're really not supposed to predict it. I know in romance novels, which is why I tend to steer clear of them, there's usually a happy ending. They usually get together in the end. That's not really my thing. But in other novels, like mysteries especially, oh my gosh, whodunits, if you know exactly who the killer is, then that's an issue. So we want to make sure to keep that in mind when we're reading those kinds of books as well. So those are the 7 elements that I use when I rate books. For each one, I go through the questions, and of course there are more than just those 4 questions. A lot of times the questions are exclusive to whatever story I'm reading, so there is a little bit of nuance when it comes to answering these questions and making sure that my rating is as accurate as possible. But at the end of the day, each of these categories or elements have a 1 to 5 star rating. And at the end, I add all 7 numbers up, divide it by 7, and that gives me my final star rating. And just for the record, it has yet to end on the nose, except for Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black, which had 5 stars in each of the categories. So that's how I end up with decimal ratings. That is how I rate books. It's all thanks to Tripadvisor. I know that people are probably watching this thinking it's really not that serious. I don't really take it seriously. I think it's fun to rate it this way. This is how I am used to reviewing. So it is really fun to pick apart books in this way and see exactly where they fall. And it's a way that I feel like I can be honest and I can show my receipts. Because a lot of times when it comes to rating books, people just like to keep it short. That's their prerogative. But I know that there have been some instances where ratings are either super low or super high, and people either think that they're just hating or that they are up the author's butt, basically. And for me, you know, I like to show my receipts. I like to tell you exactly why I love or don't love a book, and this is how I do it. If you're interested in me reviewing a book that I haven't reviewed on this channel using this system, obviously there are going to be spoilers involved, but I wouldn't mind creating spoiler reviews using this system just so you can see how everything works. Of course, I do still want to do the relationship webs and review books based on characters specifically, just because I am a character reader. But yeah, if you would like for me to do this, then that is absolutely fine. I was planning to sort of do that in this video, but I think it's running too long anyway. I think it would be better if I dedicated one book to being rated with this system. So yeah, just let me know, leave a comment. It's not something that I really plan to do, but if people are interested enough in knowing just how crazy I am when it comes to reviewing and rating books, you know, that's fine. Just warning in advance. You're going to be spoiled. But yeah, that's my system. Chatty, if you're watching, I hope you like the explanation. I hope you like the questions, and if you want to do this sort of breakdown yourself, you know, feel free. I don't own this, you know, this was inspired by Tripadvisor, but you know, it's not exclusively mine. So if you are a decimal rater and this sort of thing would help you sleep at night in justifying your decimal ratings, then please feel free to steal this if you want to, and add to it if you want to. But yeah, otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been patient. You've been great listeners. Thank you so much. Happy reading and happy reviewing.